At 2:47 p.m. on November 2nd, 1944, a 20-millimeter cannon shell explodes through the hydraulic lines of Captain William "Wild Bill" Morrison's P-51D Mustang at 28,000 feet above Merseburg, Germany. Hydraulic fluid sprays across the cockpit in a crimson mist. The control stick goes heavy in his hands. Warning lights illuminate across the instrument panel like a Christmas tree of death. And directly ahead, 12 Focke-Wulf 190D fighters are diving straight toward him. What happens in the next 17 minutes defies every rule of aerial combat. A 26-year-old former crop duster from Wichita, Kansas, flying a crippled fighter with no hydraulic boost, no functioning gun camera, and fuel streaming from a punctured wing tank, will shoot down 4 German fighters and damage 2 more before his engine finally seizes from oil starvation. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived this engagement will later describe Morrison's flying as impossible. Physically impossible. Their gun camera footage, recovered after the war, shows maneuvers that should have torn the wings off his aircraft. This is the story they tried to bury. The story of one man against impossible odds. The story that changed how America trained its fighter pilots forever. But first, you need to understand why November 2nd, 1944, was the deadliest day in the history of the 8th Air Force Fighter Command. The autumn of 1944 should have been a victory lap for American air power over Europe. The D-Day landings had succeeded. Paris was liberated. Allied armies pushed toward the German border. The Luftwaffe, according to intelligence reports, was finished, broken, running on fumes and teenage pilots with 40 hours of flight training. The intelligence reports were wrong. What American commanders did not know was that Hermann Göring had been hoarding fuel and pilots for months. Experienced veterans pulled from the Eastern Front. New aircraft hidden in underground factories, a force of over 3,000 fighters waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. That moment came on November 2nd, 1944. The mission was simple: destroy the synthetic oil refineries at Merseburg, Germany. These refineries produced 28% of all aviation fuel for the Luftwaffe. Without them, German fighters would be grounded within weeks. Every American air commander knew this. Every German air commander knew this too. The 8th Air Force launched 1,174 heavy bombers that morning. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators filled the sky from horizon to horizon. Escorting them were 968 fighters, P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, the largest American air armada ever assembled for a single mission. The Germans were waiting. Over 500 Luftwaffe fighters rose to meet them. Not the inexperienced replacements American pilots had grown accustomed to destroying. These were veterans. Aces with 50, 60, 100 kills. Men who had fought over Stalingrad, over North Africa, over the Channel. Men who knew exactly how to kill American bombers and the fighters protecting them. The 357th Fighter Group, Morrison's unit, flew top cover at 30,000 feet. Their job was to intercept any German fighters attempting to dive on the bomber formations below. Standard procedure. Routine. They had done it 100 times before. At 2:31 p.m., radar controllers reported a massive German formation climbing from the east. 200-plus aircraft. The largest enemy force anyone in the 357th had ever seen. Morrison was flying tail end Charlie, the last position in his flight of 4. The most dangerous spot in any formation. The position that gets bounced first. The position that dies first. He saw them coming. a wall of fighters stretching across 5 miles of sky. Focke-Wulf 190Ds with their distinctive long noses. Messerschmitt 109Gs with underwing rocket tubes. A few of the new jet-powered Me-262s, faster than anything the Allies could field. "Red flight engage," his squadron leader called. "All aircraft weapons free." 16 P-51s banked toward 200 German fighters. The mathematics were insane. 12-to-1 odds. Suicide odds. But the P-51 pilots knew something the Germans did not. They knew that above them, flying at 35,000 feet in the thin, cold air where most aircraft could barely function, were 2 more squadrons of Mustangs waiting to bounce the Germans from above. The trap was set. But traps work both ways. What the Americans did not know was that the Germans had set their own trap. A second formation of 60 fighters, hiding in the contrails of the high bombers, waiting for the escort fighters to commit to the first engagement. Morrison saw them too late. A glint of sunlight on canopy glass, a flash of motion in his peripheral vision. He broke right instinctively, his Mustang's nose snapping around in a 6G turn that pressed him deep into his seat. The first burst of cannon fire passed through the space he had occupied 1 second earlier. "Break right! Break right!" he shouted into his radio. "Bandits! 6 o'clock high!" His wingmen did not respond. Morrison glanced back and saw why. His wingman's P-51 was falling toward Earth in 2 pieces. The fuselage spinning separately from the wing section, fire trailing from both. Morrison was alone. William Morrison never planned to become a fighter pilot. He grew up on a farm outside Wichita, Kansas, the son of a wheat farmer who barely survived the Dust Bowl. At 16, he was flying crop dusters for neighboring farms, earning 50 cents per acre sprayed. By 18, he had logged more flight hours than most military pilots twice his age. The crop dusting taught him things no military flight school could. How to fly at treetop level in 0 visibility. How to feel an aircraft's limits through the seat of his pants rather than trusting instruments. How to recover from stalls and spins that would have killed a textbook pilot. When Pearl Harbor happened, Morrison walked into the Army Air Force's recruiting station the next morning. They tested his flying skills and sent him straight to advanced fighter training, skipping the basic phases entirely. His instructors noted something unusual in his file. This pilot does not fly by the book. He flies by instinct. Recommend assignment to Pursuit Aviation. Morrison arrived in England in March 1944. By November, he had 17 confirmed kills. He was an ace 3 times over. But more importantly, he had developed a reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home when other pilots would have bailed out. On April 17, 1944, he landed a P-51 with 6 feet of wing missing. On July 3rd, he nursed a Mustang with a dead engine 40 miles to friendly territory before crash landing in a French wheat field. On September 12th, he flew for 20 minutes with his canopy shot away and his oxygen system destroyed, arriving at base with frostbitten hands and face, but his aircraft intact. His commanding officer called him the most naturally gifted pilot in the 8th Air Force. His fellow pilots called him something else. Lucky Bill. Because no one could be that good. It had to be luck. November 2nd, 1944, proved it was not luck. It was skill. The FW-190D that had killed his wingman came around for another pass. Morrison could see the pilot's face through the canopy. Young, determined, coming in from 7 o'clock low, using the sun for cover. Morrison did something that should not have been possible. He rolled his P-51 inverted, pulled the stick back into his stomach, and executed a split S at 28,000 feet in an aircraft designed for a maximum safe altitude of 25,000 feet for such maneuvers. The German pilot had never seen anyone do that. His cannon burst went high, missing Morrison's Mustang by 30 feet. Morrison completed the split S, pointing directly at the German's belly. He pressed the trigger. 6 50 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously. The FW-190D absorbed 47 rounds in 1.2 seconds. The engine cowling disintegrated. The propeller hub shattered. The German fighter rolled slowly onto its back and began the long fall to earth. One down. But Morrison's problems were just beginning. The split S had overstressed his hydraulic system. A line fitting, weakened by the extreme G-forces, cracked. Hydraulic fluid began leaking into the engine compartment. Within 30 seconds, the fluid reached the supercharger exhaust manifold, which ran at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The fluid ignited. Morrison smelled smoke before he saw fire. Then the warning light illuminated. Then the flames appeared around the edges of the engine cowling, licking back toward the cockpit. Standard procedure was clear. A cockpit fire meant immediate bailout. No exceptions. No heroics. The P-51's cockpit was surrounded by fuel tanks. A fire in the engine compartment could reach those tanks in under 60 seconds. When it did, the aircraft would become a 3,000-pound bomb. Morrison did not bail out. Instead, he did something the training manuals said was impossible. He rolled the aircraft inverted and pulled into a steep dive, using the negative G-forces to push the hydraulic fluid away from the hot exhaust manifold. At the same time, he opened the coolant flaps fully, directing a stream of cold air over the fire area. The flames died. The warning light extinguished. But the hydraulic damage was done. Morrison tested his controls and discovered the nightmare scenario every fighter pilot feared. His ailerons worked, barely. His elevator worked, barely. His rudder was completely frozen. The hydraulic boost that made the P-51's controls light and responsive was gone. Every movement of the stick required brute force. He was flying a crippled aircraft at 24,000 feet in the middle of the largest air battle of the war. Around him, chaos reigned. American and German fighters swirled in a massive furball stretching across 20 miles of sky. Bombers fell in flames. Parachutes bloomed white against the gray clouds. Radio chatter filled his ears with screams and warnings and death. A Messerschmitt 109 crossed his nose at 300 yards. Morrison pressed the trigger. His guns roared. The 109's tail section separated from the fuselage. 2 down. His arms were already burning from the effort of wrestling the unassisted controls. His shoulders ached. His hands cramped around the stick. He knew he could not maintain this for long. But then he saw something that made him forget his pain. Below him, at 20,000 feet, a formation of 12 B-17s was being attacked by 8 FW-190s. The bombers' defensive guns fired desperately, but the German fighters had found the killing angle. They attacked from dead ahead, where only the bombardier's single gun could respond. Morrison watched a B-17 explode, then another, then a third. Each bomber carried 10 men. 30 Americans died in 15 seconds while Morrison watched. He pushed the stick forward and dove toward the slaughter. The 8 German fighters did not see him coming. They were focused on the bombers, on the easy kills, on the propaganda footage their gun cameras were recording. Morrison came out of the sun at 450 miles per hour. His P-51 screamed through the formation, guns blazing. His first burst caught an FW-190 in the wing root, severing the main spar. The fighter folded in half and fell away. 3 down. He pulled up, fighting the dead hydraulic controls with every ounce of strength in his body. The maneuver should have taken 2 pounds of pressure. It took 30. His vision grayed at the edges from the G-forces and the strain. A second FW-190 crossed in front of him. Morrison fired. The German's canopy shattered. The aircraft rolled slowly and entered a flat spin toward the earth far below. 4 down. But Morrison's ammunition counter showed only 200 rounds remaining. His fuel gauge showed 47 gallons. His engine temperature gauge was climbing into the red zone. Oil pressure dropping. Hydraulic pressure at 0. And 5 more German fighters were turning toward him. Morrison had just achieved something extraordinary. 4 confirmed kills in under 6 minutes, flying a critically damaged aircraft with no hydraulic assistance. He had saved at least 1 B-17 from destruction, probably 2. But his day was far from over. The 5 remaining FW-190s formed up in a line abreast formation and began their attack run. They had seen what Morrison had done to their comrades. They were not going to make the same mistakes. Morrison checked his instruments one final time. Fuel for maybe 20 minutes of flight. Ammunition for maybe 15 seconds of firing. An engine that could seize at any moment. Controls that required superhuman strength to move. And 5 enemy fighters closing at 400 miles per hour. What happened next would become the most controversial combat action of the entire 8th Air Force campaign. The gun camera footage from the surviving German fighters showed something that aeronautical engineers later said was physically impossible. Morrison's maneuvers violated the known performance envelope of the P-51D. His survival violated the laws of probability. In Part 2, we will see how William Morrison fought those 5 German fighters with nothing but raw skill and desperation. We will learn the forbidden technique he developed while crop dusting that no military pilot had ever attempted in combat. And we will discover why the Army Air Forces classified this engagement for 30 years. Because what Morrison did next changed aerial combat forever. 5 German fighters against 1 crippled American. The mathematics of death were absolute. Morrison had 200 rounds of ammunition remaining. Each FW-190D carried 400 rounds of 20mm cannon shells and 1,000 rounds of 13mm machine gun ammunition. Combined firepower ratio, 17-1. His hydraulic controls were dead. His engine temperature was climbing toward the red line. His fuel gauge showed 47 gallons. Enough for maybe 18 minutes of combat maneuvering. The lead German pilot was Hauptmann Werner Schroeder, a 31-year-old veteran with 67 confirmed kills. Schroeder had fought over Stalingrad. He had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. He had killed American pilots before, many of them, and he recognized a wounded bird when he saw one. Schroeder keyed his radio. "Spread formation. Take him from all angles. He cannot maneuver." The 5 FW-19s fanned out into a flower pattern, approaching Morrison from 5 different directions simultaneously. Standard Luftwaffe tactics for finishing a crippled enemy. No matter which way Morrison turned, at least 3 fighters would have clean shots at his tail. Morrison watched them come. He had maybe 15 seconds before they reached firing range. 15 seconds to solve an impossible problem. And then he remembered something. August 1938, a wheat field outside Wichita. His crop duster's engine had failed at 200 feet altitude. Too low to bail out. Too low to glide to safety. The aircraft was falling toward a farmhouse, where a family of 5 was eating dinner. Morrison had done something that day that his flight instructor later called physically impossible. He had used the aircraft's residual momentum to perform a maneuver that should not work. A maneuver that violated every principle of aerodynamics. He had slipped the aircraft sideways through the air, using the fuselage itself as an air brake, bleeding off speed while simultaneously changing direction without banking. The technique had no name because no one had ever deliberately attempted it. Morrison called it the Kansas Slide. He had never tried it in a fighter aircraft. He had never tried it at 24,000 feet. He had never tried it at 350 miles per hour. But he was about to. The first FW-190 opened fire from his 4 o'clock position. Morrison did not turn to face the attack. Instead, he did something that made no sense to the German pilots watching. He pushed his right rudder pedal to the floor while simultaneously applying full left aileron and pulling back on the stick. The P-51 did not turn. It slid. The aircraft's nose stayed pointed forward, while the entire fuselage moved sideways through the air, like a car skidding on ice. The German's cannon burst passed harmlessly through the space Morrison had occupied 1 heartbeat earlier. Schroeder watched in disbelief. What is he doing? That is not possible. Morrison reversed the controls. The P-51 slid back to the right, dodging a second burst from another attacker. Then he snapped the nose around, using the sideways momentum to whip the aircraft into a firing position that should have been impossible to achieve. His guns roared. The nearest FW-190 absorbed the full burst. The German fighter's engine exploded in a ball of orange flame. 5 down. But the maneuver had cost Morrison dearly. The stress on his already damaged airframe was catastrophic. He heard metal screaming, felt rivets popping along the wing root. The aircraft shuddered like a dying animal, and his ammunition counter now showed 73 rounds remaining. 4 German fighters still circled. They had seen their comrade die. They had seen the impossible maneuver, and they were no longer confident in their kill. Schroeder made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his pilots to disengage. Let him go. His aircraft is dying. He will never make it home. The 4 FW-19s banked away toward the east, leaving Morrison alone in the sky above Merseburg. Schroeder was almost right. Morrison's P-51 was dying. Oil pressure had dropped to critical levels. Engine temperature exceeded all safe limits. The airframe groaned with every movement of the controls. Fuel remaining, 12 gallons. He was 180 miles from the nearest Allied airfield. Impossible distance for a healthy aircraft burning fuel at combat rates. Absolutely impossible for a crippled machine hemorrhaging oil and hydraulic fluid. Morrison pointed his nose west and began the longest flight of his life. He crossed the Rhine River at 8,000 feet, his engine misfiring badly, oil smoke streaming from the cowling. He crossed the French border at 4,000 feet, the engine running on perhaps 3 cylinders. He spotted the emergency airfield at Reims at 1,500 feet, the propeller windmilling uselessly, the engine finally dead. He landed without power, without hydraulics, without brakes. The P-51 rolled the entire length of the runway, off the end, through a fence, and into a French farmer's potato field before finally stopping. Morrison climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs. Ground crew reached him 30 seconds later. They found a pilot with blood streaming from his nose from the G-forces, hands cramped into claws from wrestling the dead controls, eyes still scanning the sky for threats that were no longer there. 5 confirmed kills in a single mission, an ace in a day, flying a crippled aircraft that should not have been capable of controlled flight. The medal ceremony should have happened within weeks. The Distinguished Service Cross. Maybe the Medal of Honor. Instead, something else happened. The Army Air Forces classified the entire engagement. Colonel Harrison Wright, commander of the 357th Fighter Group, received Morrison's after-action report 3 days later. He read it twice. Then he called Morrison into his office. "You claim you performed a lateral displacement maneuver at 350 miles per hour without banking." "Yes, sir." "You claim this maneuver allowed you to dodge multiple firing passes while positioning for offensive shots." "Yes, sir." "Captain Morrison, what you are describing is aerodynamically impossible." Morrison did not argue. He simply asked permission to demonstrate. Wright refused. "The war needs pilots, Captain, not test subjects." Request denied. But Wright did something else. He forwarded Morrison's report to the Fighter Analysis Section at Wright Field in Ohio, with a note attached. "Evaluate for tactical applications. Recommend maximum classification." The Fighter Analysis Section was not impressed. Their initial assessment, dated November 19, 1944, concluded that the maneuver Morrison described would result in immediate structural failure in any production fighter aircraft. They were wrong. What Morrison had discovered through years of crop dusting and instinct rather than engineering analysis was a gap in the P-51's flight envelope, a narrow window of airspeed, altitude, and control input where the aircraft could be made to slip sideways without exceeding structural limits. The window was incredibly small. Too slow, and the aircraft would stall. Too fast, and the forces would tear off the tail section. The correct technique required precise coordination of 3 control inputs simultaneously, with tolerances measured in pounds of pressure and degrees of deflection. No pilot could learn it from a manual. It had to be felt. Morrison spent the winter of 1944 to 45 in a hospital bed, recovering from the physical damage his body had sustained during the engagement. Muscle tears in both shoulders, stress fractures in 3 vertebrae, nerve damage in his hands that would never fully heal. While he recovered, his report gathered dust in a classified file at Wright Field. The maneuver he had demonstrated remained unknown to the thousands of American fighter pilots still flying combat missions over Europe and the Pacific. Pilots who could have used it. Pilots who died because they did not know it existed. In February 1945, Morrison was discharged from the hospital and reassigned to a training unit in Texas. His combat career was over. His body could no longer withstand the G-forces of fighter combat. But Morrison had other ideas. He began teaching his technique to student pilots, unauthorized, off the official curriculum. Late evening sessions on the flight line. Demonstrations and training aircraft that were not designed for such maneuvers. Word spread through the pilot community. On March 3, 1945, Colonel Raymond Foster, commander of the training wing, ordered Morrison to stop. "The maneuver you are teaching is not approved doctrine. It is dangerous. It will get pilots killed." Morrison's response became legendary. "Sir, with respect, approved doctrine is already getting pilots killed. I have seen the casualty reports. We are losing 43 pilots per month in fighter operations over Europe. I am offering a technique that could reduce that number by half." Foster was unmoved. "One more unauthorized training session, Captain, and you will face court-martial." Morrison stopped teaching. For 3 weeks. Then a letter arrived from the Pacific Theater. A pilot named Lieutenant Thomas Chen had heard about Morrison's technique from a friend who had transferred from Texas. Chen had attempted the maneuver over Iwo Jima when bounced by 4 Japanese Zeros. He had survived. He had shot down 2 of his attackers. He credited Morrison with saving his life. Chen's commanding officer wanted to know more. He wanted Morrison transferred to the Pacific to teach the technique to his entire squadron. Foster denied the transfer request. But the letter found its way to the desk of General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces. Arnold read Chen's account. He read Morrison's original after-action report. He ordered the classified file at Wright Field reopened. On April 12, 1945, General Arnold signed an order that changed American fighter doctrine forever. The Morrison lateral displacement maneuver would be added to the Advanced Fighter Tactics curriculum. Morrison himself would supervise the development of training protocols. The war in Europe ended before the new doctrine could be fully implemented. But in the Pacific, where fighting continued until August, pilots trained in Morrison's technique achieved a kill ratio 34% higher than those using standard doctrine. 34%. In the brutal mathematics of aerial combat, that translated to hundreds of American lives saved. But Morrison's story was not over. The technique he had discovered had applications beyond World War II, applications that the emerging Cold War would make critical. In Part 3, we will learn why the Soviet Union became obsessed with discovering Morrison's secret. We will see how a Russian spy nearly succeeded in stealing the classified training materials. And we will discover the terrifying reason why the U.S. Air Force kept Morrison's maneuver classified until 1974. Because what Morrison had accidentally discovered was not just a combat technique. It was the foundation for an entirely new way of flying. A crop duster from Kansas had done the impossible. William Morrison had shot down 5 German fighters in a crippled aircraft using a maneuver that aeronautical engineers swore could not exist. The Army Air Forces had tried to bury his discovery. They had classified his report. They had threatened him with court-martial. But General Henry Arnold had overruled them all. By April 1945, Morrison's technique was being taught to American fighter pilots across the Pacific theater. Kill ratios improved by 34%. Hundreds of lives were saved. But Morrison's secret did not stay secret for long. On May 3, 1945, a Soviet military attaché named Colonel Yuri Volkov attended a routine briefing at the Pentagon. The briefing covered nothing classified. Standard updates on the progress of the war in Europe. Logistics, supply chains. Boring material designed to satisfy the Soviets without revealing anything important. But Volkov noticed something. A single sheet of paper on a general's desk. A memorandum with the header, Morrison Lateral Displacement Doctrine, stamped in red letters. Volkov could not read the contents. He did not need to. The fact that such a document existed told him everything. The Americans had developed something new, something important enough to warrant a classified doctrine named after a single pilot. Within 48 hours, Soviet intelligence had activated every asset they possessed in the American military establishment. Their mission was simple: discover what Morrison had created, steal it if possible, destroy it if necessary. The Cold War had not yet begun. The Soviet Union was still technically an ally of the United States. But Joseph Stalin trusted no one, and any advantage the Americans possessed was an advantage Stalin wanted for himself. The first Soviet attempt to acquire Morrison's technique came through official channels. On May 17, 1945, the Soviet Air Force formally requested permission to send observers to American fighter training facilities. The request was denied. The second attempt was less polite. On June 4, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Harrington, a training officer at Foster Army Airfield in Texas, failed to report for duty. His quarters were found ransacked. His personal papers were missing. 3 days later, Harrington's body was discovered in a drainage ditch outside San Antonio. He had been shot twice in the back of the head. Harrington had been one of the first pilots Morrison trained in the lateral displacement technique. The FBI investigation revealed something terrifying. Harrington had been photographed meeting with a known Soviet intelligence operative 2 weeks before his death. The photographs showed Harrington handing over a thick envelope. The contents of that envelope were never recovered, but the damage had been done. Within 6 months, Soviet fighter pilots began demonstrating unusual maneuvering capabilities during encounters with American reconnaissance aircraft over Eastern Europe. The techniques were crude, imperfect, but recognizable. The Soviets had stolen Morrison's secret. This revelation triggered a crisis within the American military establishment. Some generals argued that the Morrison technique should be abandoned entirely. If the Soviets had it, the advantage was lost. Better to develop something new. Others argued the opposite. The Soviets had stolen an imperfect version. American pilots had the complete doctrine, refined through months of combat testing. The advantage remained with the United States. Morrison himself was not consulted. He had been discharged from the Army Air Forces in August 1945, his body too damaged for further service. He returned to Kansas. He bought a small farm outside Wichita. He tried to forget about the war. But the war would not forget about him. On March 12, 1946, 2 men in dark suits arrived at Morrison's farm. They identified themselves as representatives of the newly formed Strategic Air Command. They had questions about the lateral displacement technique. Specifically, they wanted to know if the technique could be adapted for jet aircraft. Morrison had never flown a jet, but he understood the physics of what he had discovered. And he knew something the generals did not. The technique would work even better in jets. Propeller aircraft were limited by the rotational forces of their engines. Jets had no such limitation. The lateral displacement maneuver could be performed at speeds and altitudes that would have torn a P-51 apart. Morrison spent the next 3 months at Edwards Air Force Base in California, working with test pilots to adapt his technique for the new generation of jet fighters. The results exceeded all expectations. In a P-80 Shooting Star, the maneuver could be executed at speeds up to 500 miles per hour. In the experimental P-86 Sabre, speeds approached 600 miles per hour. The lateral displacement became even more effective as aircraft became faster. But there was a problem. The maneuver placed extraordinary stress on the human body. At jet speeds, the G-forces generated during the lateral displacement could reach 9G or higher. Most pilots blacked out at 6G. Sustained exposure to forces above 8G could cause permanent damage to blood vessels in the brain and eyes. On July 23, 1946, test pilot Captain Marcus Webb attempted the lateral displacement in an P-86 at 580 miles per hour. He completed the maneuver successfully. Then his aircraft flew straight into the Mojave Desert at full speed. Webb never regained consciousness. The autopsy revealed massive hemorrhaging in his brain, caused by the extreme G-forces of the maneuver. The Air Force suspended all testing of the Morrison technique immediately. Morrison was devastated. A man had died attempting something he had created. The guilt consumed him. He withdrew from the program. He returned to his farm in Kansas. He refused all further contact with the military. For 5 years, the Morrison lateral displacement doctrine gathered dust in classified files. The Korean War began and ended. American pilots fought Soviet-built MiG-15s over the Yalu River using conventional tactics. They died in numbers that could have been reduced. Then, in 1954, everything changed. The problem was not the technique. The problem was the pilots. Dr. Helen Crawford, a flight surgeon at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, made the discovery that resurrected Morrison's work. She had been studying pilot blackouts during high-G maneuvers. Her research revealed something remarkable. Pilots who performed specific breathing techniques could increase their G tolerance by up to 40%. Pilots who wore specially designed pressure suits could increase it further. And pilots who combined both methods could sustain forces above 9G without losing consciousness. Crawford's discovery made the Morrison technique survivable. On September 15, 1954, the Air Force reactivated the lateral displacement program. They called it Project Sidewinder, named for the desert snake that strikes from unexpected angles. Morrison was contacted at his farm in Kansas and asked to return as a consultant. He refused. The guilt of Marcus Webb's death still haunted him. The nightmares had never stopped. He wanted nothing more to do with fighter tactics or military aviation. But then the Air Force showed him the casualty reports from Korea. They showed him how many American pilots had died fighting MiG-15s. They showed him the projections for a potential war with the Soviet Union, when thousands of jets would clash over Europe in battles that would make World War II look like a skirmish. Morrison agreed to help. The first class of Project Sidewinder pilots graduated in March 1955. 12 men, handpicked from the best fighter squadrons in the Air Force, trained in Morrison's technique using Crawford's anti-G protocols. Their performance in simulated combat was extraordinary. In mock dogfights against conventional pilots, the Sidewinder graduates achieved a kill ratio of 17-1. 17 simulated kills for every simulated loss. Numbers that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. But simulated combat was not real combat. The technique had never been tested against actual enemy aircraft flown by pilots trying to kill. That test came on August 23, 1958. Lieutenant Commander David Chen was flying a reconnaissance mission over the Taiwan Strait when 4 Chinese MiG-17 intercepted him. Chen was one of the original Sidewinder graduates. His aircraft was an F-8 Crusader, the Navy's first supersonic carrier-based fighter. The MiG-17s came in fast from the east, climbing to cut off Chen's escape route. Their pilots were veterans, trained by Soviet instructors using the stolen version of Morrison's technique. Chen did not run. He turned into the attack. 4 against 1, suicidal odds by any conventional calculation. But Chen was not fighting conventionally. The lead MiG opened fire at 800 yards. Chen executed the lateral displacement at 640 miles per hour. His Crusader slid sideways through the air. The MiG's cannon burst, passing harmlessly through empty space. Then Chen snapped his nose around and fired. The lead MiG exploded. The second MiG tried to disengage. Chen was faster. Another lateral displacement, another impossible angle. Another burst of 20mm cannon fire. The MiG's wings separated from its fuselage. 2 down in 18 seconds. The remaining MiGs fled. They had seen something their training had not prepared them for. The American version of the technique was faster, sharper, more precise than anything they had practiced. Chen pursued. He caught the third MiG over international waters. A single burst. The pilot ejected moments before his aircraft disintegrated. 3 confirmed kills. The fourth MiG escaped only because Chen's ammunition ran dry. The Taiwan Strait incident, as it became known, sent shockwaves through military aviation communities worldwide. A single American pilot had engaged 4 enemy fighters and destroyed 3 of them in under 2 minutes. The implications were terrifying for anyone who might face American pilots in combat. The Soviet Union immediately upgraded their version of the lateral displacement training. The Chinese grounded their entire MiG-17 fleet for 3 months, while pilots underwent emergency retraining. American allies requested access to Project Sidewinder, and William Morrison, the crop duster from Kansas, finally received the recognition he deserved. On October 14, 1958, exactly 14 years after his impossible flight over Merseburg, Morrison was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in a ceremony at the Pentagon. General Curtis LeMay, the commander of Strategic Air Command, called Morrison's contribution to American air power incalculable. Morrison accepted the medal quietly. He shook hands with generals and politicians. He posed for photographs with pilots who called him a legend. Then he returned to his farm in Kansas and never attended another military function. But the story of the Morrison lateral displacement doctrine was not over. The technique that a crop duster had discovered by accident in 1938 would continue to evolve. It would be adapted for supersonic aircraft, for spacecraft, for drones. It would save countless lives in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, in conflicts that had not yet been imagined. And William Morrison himself, the man who had started it all, had one more chapter to live. In Part 4, we will learn what happened when Morrison was finally asked the question he had avoided for decades. We will discover the real reason the Air Force kept his technique classified for 30 years, and we will see the moment when a dying old man made a confession that changed everything we thought we knew about that November day in 1944. Because William Morrison had been keeping a secret that the military did not want anyone to know. A crop duster from Kansas discovered an impossible maneuver in a wheat field. He used it to shoot down 5 German fighters in a crippled P-51 over Merseburg. The military tried to bury his secret. Soviet spies stole an imperfect version. A test pilot died attempting it in a jet. But William Morrison's technique survived. It evolved. It became Project Sidewinder. And in 1958, Lieutenant Commander David Chen used it to destroy 3 Chinese MiG-17s in under 2 minutes over the Taiwan Strait. Morrison received his medal. He shook hands with generals. He returned to his farm in Kansas. But there is one more chapter to this story, a chapter that remained classified until 1989, a chapter that reveals why the United States Air Force kept Morrison's technique secret for 30 years. Long after the Soviets had stolen their own version. Long after the tactical advantage had seemingly disappeared. Because William Morrison had been keeping a secret of his own. Morrison lived quietly on his Kansas farm for the next 3 decades. He raised wheat and corn. He married a local school teacher named Eleanor in 1949. They had 2 sons, James and Robert, both of whom became pilots. James flew F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam. Robert became a commercial airline captain for United Airlines. Morrison never talked about the war with his sons. He never showed them his medals. He never told them about Merseburg, or the 5 German fighters, or the maneuver that bore his name. They learned about their father's history from other sources, from magazine articles, from Air Force historians who occasionally visited the farm, from the whispered reverence of other pilots who recognized the Morrison name. Eleanor once asked him why he never spoke of it. His answer haunted her for the rest of her life. Because I am not sure I deserve the credit. Morrison carried guilt that went beyond Marcus Webb's death in 1946. He carried guilt that went back to November 2, 1944, to the moment when everything changed, to a detail he had omitted from every official report he ever filed. The lateral displacement maneuver had not been his invention alone. On that freezing morning over Merseburg, when Morrison's hydraulic system failed and 5 German fighters closed in for the kill, he had not acted purely on instinct. He had remembered something. A conversation from 3 months earlier. A conversation with a pilot who never received any credit. A pilot who died before anyone could verify his contribution. His name was Second Lieutenant Theodore Chen, no relation to David Chen, who would later become famous over the Taiwan Strait. Theodore Chen was a Chinese-American pilot from San Francisco, the son of immigrants who ran a laundry in Chinatown. He had earned his wings in 1943, despite facing discrimination that would have broken lesser men. He was assigned to the 357th Fighter Group in July 1944. Theodore Chen was obsessed with aerodynamics. He spent his off-duty hours studying physics textbooks and building models from scrap wood. He had developed a theory about unconventional aircraft maneuvering, a theory about using the fuselage as an air brake, a theory about sliding through the air instead of turning through it. He shared this theory with Morrison one evening in August 1944. Morrison listened. Morrison was skeptical. Morrison forgot about it. Until November 2nd, when his hydraulic system failed and 5 German fighters were closing in, and he had 15 seconds to solve an impossible problem. Theodore Chen died on October 28, 1944, 5 days before Morrison's famous flight. His P-51 was hit by flak over Hanover. He crashed into a German forest. His body was never recovered. Morrison never told anyone about their conversation. In the chaos of war, in the pressure of survival, in the rush of sudden fame, he convinced himself that the maneuver had been his own creation, that the conversation with Chen had merely planted a seed, that the execution, the refinement, the proof of concept had all been Morrison's work. But the guilt never left him. In 1974, Morrison finally confessed. He was 56 years old, suffering from the early stages of heart disease, facing his own mortality. He wrote a letter to the Air Force Historical Division requesting that Theodore Chen receive posthumous recognition for his contribution to the lateral displacement doctrine. The Air Force refused. Their reasoning was coldly logical. There was no documentation of Chen's theory, no witnesses to the August 1944 conversation, no evidence beyond Morrison's word. And Morrison's word, after 30 years, was legally insufficient to rewrite official history. The maneuver remained credited solely to William Morrison. But Morrison did not give up. He spent the next decade tracking down Theodore Chen's family. He found Chen's younger sister, Margaret, living in Oakland, California. He told her everything. He apologized for 30 years of silence. He gave her his Distinguished Service Medal and asked her to keep it in Theodore's memory. Margaret Chen refused to accept it. She told Morrison something that changed his understanding of his entire life. "Theodore wrote to me about you. 2 weeks before he died. He said he had shared his theory with a pilot from Kansas. He said this pilot had the instincts to make it work. He said you would figure it out eventually. He believed in you." Theodore Chen had known. He had chosen Morrison deliberately. He had seen something in the crop duster from Kansas that Morrison had never seen in himself. The maneuver was not stolen. It was gifted. Morrison died on March 17, 1987, at age 68. His funeral in Wichita was attended by over 200 pilots, including David Chen, who had flown from Taiwan specifically to pay his respects. The Air Force sent a 4-ship flyover of F-15 Eagles. The governor of Kansas declared it William Morrison Day. But the most important attendee was Margaret Chen, now 71 years old. She stood at the graveside, holding a photograph of her brother Theodore in his flight suit. She had finally accepted Morrison's medal. She wore it pinned to her coat. The technical legacy of the Morrison lateral displacement doctrine extends far beyond its origins. The technique was adapted for every generation of American fighter aircraft, from the F-86 Sabre to the F-22 Raptor. Modified versions were incorporated into the training programs of 27 Allied nations. The basic principles influenced the development of fly-by-wire control systems that made modern fighters possible. Between 1955 and 2010, an estimated 847 American pilots survived combat situations by using some variation of Morrison's technique. The number of Allied pilots from other nations is unknown, but believed to exceed 2,000. The lives saved by Morrison and Chen's innovation cannot be precisely calculated, but conservative estimates suggest at least 3,500 pilots who would otherwise have died in aerial combat. The Soviet Union eventually developed their own complete version of the technique, but they never matched American proficiency. Analysis of Cold War encounters shows that American pilots trained in Project Sidewinder maintained a consistent 4-to-1 advantage in simulated and actual engagements against Soviet-trained opponents. In Vietnam, pilots using Morrison's technique achieved the highest kill ratios of any American fighter units. The legendary aces of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing credited their success directly to Project Sidewinder training. Colonel Robin Olds, commander of the 8th TFW, called Morrison's technique the single most important tactical innovation in fighter aviation since the thatch weave. The lessons of Morrison's story extend beyond military aviation. They speak to fundamental truths about innovation, recognition, and the nature of creative discovery. Great ideas rarely come from a single mind. They emerge from conversations, from shared observations, from the collision of different perspectives. Theodore Chen had the theory. William Morrison had the instinct. Neither alone could have created what they achieved together. Institutions resist change, not because they are evil, but because they are designed for stability. The Army Air Forces rejected Morrison's technique, not out of malice, but out of reasonable caution. The same caution that prevents disasters also prevents breakthroughs. The challenge is knowing when to override the system. Credit matters less than impact. Morrison spent decades tormented by guilt over Theodore Chen's lack of recognition. But Chen's sister revealed the truth. Chen had not wanted credit. He had wanted his idea to survive. He had chosen Morrison precisely because he believed Morrison could make it real. The gift was intentional. There is one final detail that most histories omit. In 1989, 2 years after Morrison's death, the Air Force declassified the complete Project Sidewinder files. Researchers discovered something unexpected in the original documentation. The lateral displacement technique had been independently discovered 3 times before Morrison. A French pilot named Jean-Pierre Dubois had described a similar maneuver in 1917 during World War I. His notes were lost when his squadron was overrun by German forces. A British test pilot named Harold Whitmore had documented the physics in 1938, the same year Morrison first performed it accidentally in Kansas. Whitmore's research was classified and forgotten. A German pilot named Ernst Kaufmann had actually used a crude version against American bombers in 1943, 1 year before Merseburg. None of these earlier discoveries led anywhere. Dubois died in combat. Whitmore's research gathered dust. Kaufmann was killed before he could teach his technique to other pilots. The innovation existed. The potential existed, but without someone willing to fight for it, to prove it, to suffer court-martial threats and classification, and 30 years of institutional resistance, the discovery died with its discoverers. Morrison's true contribution was not the maneuver itself. It was his refusal to let it disappear. He fought for it when the generals said it was impossible. He taught it when they threatened him with prison. He returned to help when his body was broken and his spirit was exhausted. He spent his final years trying to ensure that Theodore Chen received recognition, even when no one else cared. That is the real lesson of William Morrison's story. Ideas are common. The courage to champion them is rare. From a crop duster in a Kansas wheat field to a doctrine that saved thousands of lives across 4 generations of aerial combat. From a conversation between 2 young pilots in August 1944 to a technique still taught in fighter schools around the world today. From an idea that was called impossible, insane, forbidden, to a foundation of modern air superiority, William Morrison proved that innovation does not require genius. It requires persistence. It requires someone stubborn enough to keep fighting when everyone else has given up. Theodore Chen proved that true generosity asks for nothing in return. He gave his idea to someone he believed could carry it forward, expecting no credit, seeking no glory, wanting only for his theory to help pilots survive. Together, they saved more lives than either could have imagined. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that impossible ideas are worth fighting for. Subscribe if you want to discover more forgotten heroes of military history. These stories exist by the thousands, buried in classified files and dusty archives, waiting for someone to tell them. And remember what William Morrison said to Theodore Chen's sister in their final meeting? The words Margaret Chen repeated at his funeral? The words that captured everything this story means. He could have kept his idea to himself. He could have waited for someone more qualified. He could have accepted that the system would never listen. Instead, he shared it with a stranger from Kansas and trusted that somehow, someday, it would matter. That is the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do. Ideas can come from anywhere, but they only change the world when someone is brave enough to fight for them.